A young couple become the victims of a terrifying assault.
This crime scene was one of the bloodiest that I've ever seen.
I could see a slash across his throat.
She had several lacerations to her hands as well as to her abdomen.
For law enforcement, one of their biggest priorities was to figure out who would want to do this to either of them.
The evidence seems to point to a jealous stalker.
She had mentioned that a guy named John with dreads had followed her.
He would pop up like in crazy places.
But as the investigation unfolds, detectives begin to question everything about the case.
This trail of blood led to the kitchen.
There was 2 knives missing.
How did the suspect know exactly where to go to get the knife?
It did not make sense to me.
The math just was not mathing. Detectives are starting to believe that John really didn't exist.
January 17th, 2010. It's 3:30 a.m. in Shreveport, Louisiana, when police receive an emergency call from 24-year-old Kimethia Coleman.
Shreveport police, what's your emergency?
Somebody's trying to kill my boyfriend.
Oh, I gotta kill your boyfriend?
Oh, God!
She's saying that her boyfriend, Brian Spinks, they both have been attacked. This person ran out of the apartment and she doesn't know where he is.
Help me, please. I took the knife out of him. Help me, please.
Okay, he was stabbed.
Help me.
Minutes later, officers arrive at the address, where they find 29-year-old Brian Spinks lying motionless by the door.
I could see stab wounds about the head. I could see a slash across his throat. There was a great amount of blood to where when you step into the living room, you could hear the sound of liquid in the carpet.
They were able to quickly establish that Brian was dead.
Kim is screaming hysterically, and she's yelling, "Why would he do this?"
The officers secure the scene and escort Kimethia out of the apartment. They try to calm her down so she can explain what happened.
Kimethia appeared to be in a state of shock. She was covered head to toe in blood, and she was very distraught.
When they asked her who did this, she described a man with dreadlocks in a red shirt. She said he left. She didn't know which direction he went.
And it's normal for a victim or someone who sees a traumatic event not to be able to divulge what occurred right then. She was also injured, so we had to get her treatment and take her to the hospital.
She had several lacerations to her hands as well as to her abdomen and her leg.
As Kimethia is transported to a hospital, homicide detectives arrive to take over the investigation. Before entering the apartment, they speak with 2 potential witnesses.
The initial responding officers had located a vehicle at the apartment complex. The vehicle was stopped and the individuals were contacted and found out to be friends of Miss Kimethia Coleman.
They were with her earlier in the day. They had arrived at the apartment to check on her when she didn't answer her phone. Whenever we interview witnesses, we want to find out anything we can, whatever they know. What type of relationship they have with the victim, what knowledge they have prior to the events that occurred.
For law enforcement, one of their biggest priorities was to figure out who was Brian Spinks, who was Kimethia Coleman, and who would want to hurt them, who would want to do this to either of them.
Brian Dennis Spinks was born December 15, 1980 in St. Louis, Missouri. He grew up in a family with a proud history of military service.
Brian was the second child, but the first boy. And subsequently, he had 2 younger brothers.
His father was in the military. Our mother, she was a DOD, Department of Defense employee for security assistance.
It goes all the way back to his great-grandfather being in the Korean War. My father and my grandfather were both in World War II. And then, of course, me in the Marine Corps.
After high school in 1999, Brian followed the family tradition and enlisted in the Air Force. But before he deployed, his life changed.
I met Brian Spinks, I want to say back in the summer of 2000. It was my senior year of high school. Brian had just joined the Air Force, and he had swung by the high school to help with all the recruiters. Brian was very attractive, and his smile was remarkable. We dated for about 6 months, and I found out I was pregnant with Amani.
In January 2001, Brian became a father, but the romance didn't last.
He, of course, military obligations, and I felt alone because the military had #1 priority.
He was going to do the full ride. Wouldn't have had a problem getting a job after the Air Force.
Shortly after Monty was born, Brian was gone to Iraq. He took long tours.
He, did what the best he could and spoke to his son when he could, had the relationship with his son's mom. They co-parented.
It was very difficult, especially as Amani started getting older.
When we did spend time together in person, we had a good time. He made me feel loved. I cried when he left. But I understand what he was doing. He had to serve his country.
While stationed in Montgomery, he had a daughter with another woman in the Air Force.
Once she became pregnant, she got discharged from the Air Force and went home to, I think, Buffalo, New York. So that was difficult in itself. And Brian only got to see her a few times. He did the best he could from a distance.
But while on deployment, Brian's focus was on the men in his unit.
Brian and I met when I was in the Air Force back in 2002. He and I were both stationed at Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana. He was kind of the organizer between all of us. We all just kind of meshed because this is the only family that we had. Our families were in different countries, different places, and he made sure that we had a place to come and congregate.
By the time he returned home in 2008, Brian was ready to focus on his family.
When he came home, it was always about Amani.
It was good, He talked, he checked on me. I ain't want for nothing.
At a friend's get-together later that year, Brian met someone new, a young woman named Kimethia Coleman.
Kimethia Coleman was from a small town about 30 minutes outside of Shreveport. Just about everyone who knew her loved her and liked her. She was very popular. Prom queen, homecoming queen, you name it.
Kimethia was a very sweet girl. I talked to her almost every Sunday, and she would always be in church.
Kimethia went on to go to Grambling State University. She chose a life of service as a social worker. She dedicated her life to serving and helping other people.
She was seemed like almost the perfect girl to introduce to your family and to settle down with. Brian had never been this serious about someone until Kimethia came along.
But little more than a year after they began dating, Brian has been killed by an unknown assailant. And investigators are now questioning 2 women outside the couple's apartment.
One was a longtime friend, the Kimethia Coleman's, and then the second individual was her sister. So the friend advises that She had been at the club with her sister and Miss Coleman downtown in Shreveport.
The women say Camethea seemed upset that evening, and it had something to do with another man.
She had mentioned to the sisters that a guy named John with dreads had followed her. One of the sisters said that she did see someone at the club with dreads, but a lot of black males at that time wore dreads, and so nothing stood out to her.
They say Brian was also at the club, but neither he nor Camethea stayed for long.
There's a brief conversation between the two, and Brian leaves. Then the friends notice, minutes later, Camethea leaves.
And within a few minutes of Camethea leaving, they left to see if Camethea's car was still there, and they didn't see it. So they went to Brian's to make sure she got where she was going. When they got there, they heard the screaming, and they saw the police coming, and they knew something was terribly wrong.
To detectives, the women appeared genuine in their account of the evening. So the investigation is just beginning.
We didn't have enough to go on, so we needed to speak with Camethea to find out who is John and get more information on why he followed her to Brian's apartment.
Coming up, evidence reveals the brutality of the attack.
The fact that the knife was broken is indicative of a very powerful or angry strike.
And detectives speak with Camethea.
You got a gentleman. He comes back from the kitchen.
After speaking with Camethea Coleman's friends about the events leading up to the fatal stabbing of Brian Spinks, investigators turn their attention to the crime scene.
Police are not able to talk to Kim. Her wounds are being tended to, and they're hoping that the scene could give them the answers to this puzzle.
This crime scene was one of the bloodiest that I've ever seen. They observed what they thought to be at least 30 wounds to Brian. The cut from his neck, which almost had decapitated Brian, was what the lethal blow was. The amount of blood in the apartment and the amount of injuries that Brian sustained is indicative of a person with a lot of rage or anger. They have some reason to be mad enough to do that kind of damage and that much damage to another individual.
The murder weapons, a pair of knives found near Brian's body, seem to confirm their assessment.
There was a knife that was intact. There was also another knife that was close by that was a handle, and the blade was located in another part of the living room. The fact that the knife was broken is indicative of a very powerful or angry strike.
This trail of blood led to the kitchen, and they notice that on the kitchen counter is this knife block.
There was 2 knives missing from the knife block that also match the knives that were laying next to Brian Spinks' body.
And now they are able to kind of put the pieces together that these 2 knives came off the kitchen counter.
We did search the front door to see any type of jarring or kick marks or pry marks or anything, and none were located.
They start wondering, how did he get in? Did someone leave a door unlocked?
Police canvass the apartment complex, but none of the neighbors they speak to saw what happened. That leaves one person who might be able to identify the killer, and she's in the hospital.
Police now find that Camithia's wounds are not life-threatening, so they are able to talk with her.
Camithia was brought to the Violent Crimes Office there at the Shreveport Police Department, roughly around 7 a.m.
Obviously, we all know why we're here. We're investigating the stabbing of Brian.
Is he okay?
We'll discuss all that now. Will you talk to us?
Is Brian okay? It's always my mom.
He's dead.
His ass follow me.
Camithia tells police that she was out on the town. It was a girls' night out.
They went to a couple of different establishments, had a few drinks, and then they ended up at Gigi's. Gigi's is one of the larger clubs in downtown Shreveport. Not long after they got to Gigi's, they saw Brian.
Tell me about that.
We talked and he got upset and he left.
Camithia advised us that whenever her and Brian went out separately, that they weren't supposed to meet up at the same club or go to the same places.
They had an agreement that if one comes to the club, the other one has to leave. So Brian leaves.
She said that she decided to go back to Brian's apartment to make sure that everything was cool.
Camithia advised us that her and Brian were back at his apartment. And they were kind of talking.
All of a sudden, and he stabbed Brian. He had like 2 or 3 times. And all I do, I know I hit him a couple of times.
She said she tried to jump on him, and he pushed her back. After he finished stabbing Brian, he just gets up and runs off.
You keep saying ass. Who was the ass?
Camithia explains that John was a man she dated casually in the past, and he seemed to have gotten the wrong idea.
I mean, I told him there would never be anything because I was with him. I was crying. And I mean, after a couple of months, he got the picture, but then he showed back up. He would pop up like in crazy places.
Camithia stated she saw him at the library. She also saw him near her apartment and later saw him at the club with her friends.
Despite the alarming run-ins with this man over the past month, Camithia seems strangely unable to provide investigators with any details.
She could never tell us a phone number, or she couldn't even tell us his last name. She stated that he drives different cars and he will call her from different payphones.
And the fact that she can't give us specific information about this John had us starting to question exactly what she was telling us.
Police realized that she could still be in shock. So they decide to go to the cell phones.
They asked Camithia for permission to go through her cell phone.
There are 3 voicemails on her phone. 2 of them are from friends talking about going out that night and making plans for the night. And then that 3rd voicemail is from Brian.
He left the voicemail in between the time he left the club and the time that she arrived at his apartment. He advised that he was done, he was breaking up with her. Prior to us hearing that, it appeared that her and Brian's relationship was fine.
As the detectives confront her with this voicemail, she changes. Her demeanor changes.
Hey, Kim. Why did he break up with you, Mom?
He didn't break up with me tonight. We always go through this. It's not a big deal.
Officer just left him at the morgue. So yeah, it's a big deal. It's a very big deal.
4 hours after Brian Spinks was found stabbed to death in his apartment. Investigators have just heard a voicemail from that same night in which he broke up with his girlfriend, Kimethia Coleman. The new information has them questioning if her story of a violent home invasion by a jealous stalker is true.
At that point, she asks to speak to Detective Farquhar alone. They had developed a bit of a rapport, and she trusted him in a way that she hadn't developed trust with the other detectives.
We step outside into a little room to where we can still watch Kimethia and Detective Farquhar in their interview, but Kimethia can't see us.
I was hoping that she would finally confide in me exactly what happened.
What got you sleeping tonight, girls? Don't be embarrassed, okay? It's just me. They're out of here.
At that point, she started telling me that Brian had, in the past as well as that night, has hit her and abused her, but she felt that she deserved it, and so she didn't say anything to anyone.
Kimethia stated that they argued in Brian's apartment, that he'd been drinking, he was drunk, and she stated that he grabbed her by the hand, causing a minor bruise, and then Brian grabbed her throat, strangling her.
She said she pushed him off, and that's when he went into the kitchen and got a knife.
No, it's harder. You gotta tell me if he comes back from the kitchen.
According to Kimethia, he begins to stab her about the legs and stomach area.
She said she had to do something in order to defend herself in that moment.
So she, at that point, got up, went into the kitchen, got her own knife.
And I was like, if I don't do something, I'll kill you.
So you just kept stabbing. When did his throat get cut? Because it was cut bad.
The guy did follow me here.
Sean did?
Mm-hmm.
Was he in the apartment when all this happened?
Yes, he did. He come in, and I was like, I was like, what are you doing there?
She's changing the story now. It has now gone from John breaking into the apartment and attacking Brian to John walking into the apartment as she and Brian were fighting.
It kind of confused her story. The fact that she brought John back in did not make sense to me.
So he showed up in the middle of y'all fighting? And what all did he do?
He got the knife and just started jabbing or whatever. I guess he was trying to make it look like I did.
It made no sense to anyone in that room. Like, the math just was not mathing. At this point, detectives are starting to believe that John really didn't exist. The question that the detectives asked was, why didn't you just leave? You're being attacked, you're able to get away, but instead of leaving, you grab a weapon and you come back to the fight.
I was trying to protect myself. I was trying to talk to him, tell him to calm down. I'm like, okay, are you really gonna do this right now?
At that point, I advised Detective Holmes and Agent Dunkel to come back in. I asked Kimethia to repeat what she had told me to them. At that point, she advised for an attorney. So the interview was concluded.
Since it appears the stabbing was a crime of passion, police charge Kimethia Coleman with manslaughter. Under Louisiana state law, they have 72 hours to gather any additional evidence.
Within the 72-hour period, a detective will gather all the pertinent information to corroborate the charge or upgrade it to second-degree murder. And with that being said, they would gather more evidence, talk to more witnesses, talking to anybody that knew her or Brian Spinks and their relationship.
Coming up, witnesses provide troubling new details about events leading up to the murder.
She threatened to beat his ass there at the club.
And medical analysis casts doubt on Camithia's story.
The coroner identified 64 stab wounds.
It's hard for me to fathom this incident being self-defense.
It's been nearly 12 hours since Brian Spinks' murder, and loved ones have started to learn the tragic news.
I just had randomly come in to my mom's house, and she hung up the phone and she screamed my name, and it was just something about the way she screamed it. And she told me the news that Brian was killed. Just in shock.
With Camithia Coleman in custody, detectives turn their attention to locating the alleged stalker she continues to claim murdered her boyfriend.
Now that Camithia's story is not making much sense, it's very important for police to rule out the John theory. Police did locate a person that fit John's description. He said he didn't know Camithia and he didn't know Brian. They weren't able to find any type of evidence on him, no blood, no knife wounds.
With the suspect having to be so close to the victim, it would have been nearly impossible for the person to not have some kind of evidence transfer from the victim to their person.
Blood is very slippery, and when someone is stabbing someone, generally the knife will slip and they will cut themselves during the event. This gentleman that was stopped had no injuries whatsoever on him.
It was very clear, this is not John.
Not only are investigators unable to find John, there is no evidence he exists at all.
Surveillance cameras were captured from Gigi's. There was no black male with dreadlocks with a red shirt that was walking around Gigi's, stalking her.
We were unable to locate any witnesses that saw this guy, John, or any video to corroborate Camithia's statement that she saw him at the club or that she saw him at the library.
It became apparent to police that Camithia had literally sent them on a goose chase to find another suspect that was non-existent.
The discovery means there were only 2 people in the apartment when the stabbing occurred: Brian and Camithia.
She stabbed him in a rage. There was no John in the picture whatsoever. But it is better for detectives to still go a little bit further to get more evidence, talk to her family, talk to friends.
I did receive a phone call from Brian's father, and he advised that Brian, within the past couple of weeks, was getting ready to part ways with Camithia.
His description to me was, "Dad, I'm being smothered." He told me, wasn't seeing any other girls, just her. But she was smothering him. And he needed some time away.
She had been pressuring him about marriage, and he didn't feel like he was ready for that.
She was getting up at night, going in his phone, going in his emails, searching the house, going through the drawers, looking for some type of incriminating evidence that he's dating another girl. It progressively got worse. the jealousness and the insecurities.
Brian's loved ones say the tension between him and Camethea finally reached a breaking point on the night of January 17th.
Air Force OSI detectives interviewed the Brian Spinks friends who went out with him that night. They state that Brian was at Gigi's dancing with a friend, but not intimately or anything of that nature, just a friendly dance with another female. Camethea sees Brian dancing with this female. She gets enraged and figures this must be a side piece, and they argue.
She threatened to beat his ass there at the club for dancing with someone else.
That night, I saw a different side of Kim that I had never seen before. I had never seen her react this way. Eventually, cooler heads prevailed, and we sat down with Kim. She said to me, she was like, Shane, I'm sorry. I love him, and, I overreacted. And so, in my mind, the night was over, and everything was fine. I had no idea what happened after that until the next morning.
Through all the interviews that we did, we feel that Camethea was jealous, and that when Brian tried to break it off with her, that just made her lose her mind. And that if she couldn't have him, no one could.
Police in Shreveport, Louisiana have arrested Camethea Coleman for stabbing her boyfriend Brian Spinks to death. But Camethea insists she was acting in self-defense.
Being that there was accusation of abuse, we pulled up any type of police records, but there were no records between Brian Spinks or Camethea.
Investigators look to Brian's autopsy to provide definitive answers.
Once the coroner got him down to the morgue and they conducted the autopsy, they identified 64 stab wounds.
When somebody's trying to defend themselves from an attacker, they are trying to de-escalate the situation, trying to put a little distance between them and their attacker just to stop the incident from occurring. It's hard for me to fathom this incident being self-defense.
Detectives are left with, how is it that this 100-pound female was able to overtake this 5'11", muscle-bound male who's in the military?
When we got the autopsy report back, it showed that his blood alcohol level was over twice the legal limit, and that he probably would not have been able to fight back.
Her entire defense on the self-defense side was, he attacked me. There was no way that Brian, with the .174 blood alcohol content, attacked her, walked to the kitchen, came back, and stabbed her.
Camethea's own injuries also seem to contradict her story.
She first claimed that John had stabbed her, and then she claimed that Brian had stabbed her during their fight in which she was defending herself.
But the Caddo Parish coroner said that they were not penetrating, that they were superficial wounds, which would lead him to believe that they were self-inflicted.
Maybe the murder was not premeditated, but she went to extreme lengths to create evidence, to create the optics that would support her story. She was desperate to stay out of trouble, so much so that she harmed herself.
On January 19th, 2010, less than 72 hours after Brian's murder, Prosecutors upgrade Camithia's charges from manslaughter to second-degree murder.
Second-degree murder is the intentional killing of another person, whereas manslaughter is killing someone in the heat of the moment. The fact that she did 64 stab wounds to him as well as a severe laceration to his throat was more indicative that she meant to kill him.
The behavior they said she displayed wasn't the Kim I know, wasn't the Kim I've talked to. I couldn't believe the viciousness.
A trial date is set, but as her day in court approaches, Camithia's attorneys introduce a new strategy for her defense.
She pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. There were motions filed, there was a mental evaluation conducted, and she was deemed incompetent to stand trial. She was transferred to a mental health facility for 90 days. At the end of that 90 days, she had a second evaluation.
November 2011, it was determined that Camithia Coleman was able to stand trial and testify.
On April 23, 2012, Camithia Coleman's murder trial begins. Despite the results of her psychiatric evaluation, her defense remains the same.
Battered wife syndrome was one of the elements of her insanity defense, that she was beaten enough and that she was abused and endured so much abuse that one day she just couldn't take anymore and she fought back.
The defense tried to paint Brian as an abusive person and tried to claim that he had PTSD because he had served in the Middle East and that he came back and took all of that out on Camithia.
For prosecutors, the question is whether the jury will believe it.
Only two people know what really occurred during the relationship, and one of them is no longer here to tell their story.
At her murder trial, Camithia Coleman claims the abuse she suffered at the hands of her boyfriend, Brian Spinks, drove her to commit a desperate act of self-preservation. Police and prosecutors say otherwise.
Throughout the investigation and throughout the preparation for the trial, there was just no evidence that pointed to Brian being an abusive person.
She was saying that he beat on women and he beat on me. Brian wouldn't hit a fly.
Camithia Coleman is a disturbed female who could not take no from her boyfriend, who did not want to be with her anymore. That's what made her snap.
Prosecutors present Camithia's 911 call as definitive proof her actions were premeditated.
I went back and listened to that phone call. You can hear Brian in the background. She gets real loud and kind of screams. And if you listen closely, you can hear Brian start to gurgle.
Okay, what's going on there?
I think that is when she delivered the final blow while she was on the phone with 911.
Hearing his voice one last time, crying for help, was truly gut-wrenching.
I can't imagine a human being doing what she did to somebody. What she did was... That man didn't deserve to leave like that.
Who would have thought? A sweet young lady with a future, a loving family. Who would believe she would do such a horrendous crime? I just couldn't believe it. And she turned into another person that night, as if she was possessed.
The jury in this trial deliberated 2 hours, and they came back with a unanimous guilty as charged verdict of second-degree murder.
Camethea Coleman is sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole.
She will not spend another day in freedom. She'll be locked up, but that still doesn't help his friends and family.
We was trying to plan Amani a big surprise birthday party because it was going to be the first time Brian was in the U.S. when his birthday hit.
She took that from me. And man, that was supposed to be my guide through life, you know? Like, she took that, and I can't get that back.
I believe Brian would be extremely proud of his son, of the man that he has become.
I wasn't completely stripped because I got a grandson that reminds me of every time I look at him and talk to him. His same voice. Brian still is.
We respect what he did in the service, the sacrifice that he made. Great father, willing to do anything for the kids, even though it's from afar.
I still feel his spirit around me. He was a good person, you know? No matter what happened, you know, even how he died, that ain't who he was. My father wasn't abusive. He took care of his kids. I just want people to know that my father was a good man.
It started with a sound that nobody could later agree on because memory under pressure fractures in different directions, and what remains is not truth but interpretation. And in Willow Creek, Texas, interpretation became its own kind of silence, a collective agreement to not look too closely at the exact moment everything changed. Some said it was a scream cut short by distance. Others insisted it was nothing at all, just wind pushing through the dry gaps of late winter, brushing against wooden fences and sleeping rooftops like an animal searching for a way in. One man, 2 streets away, claimed he heard a car door close at an unnatural hour, precise and deliberate, as if whoever closed it wanted the sound to be remembered. Another woman swore she saw a light flicker in a backyard that should have been dark, a brief pulse like a heartbeat that did not belong to any living thing she could name. But all of them agreed on one detail, without hesitation. The night felt wrong. Not violent in the obvious sense, not storm-torn or chaotic, but subtly misaligned, as if reality had shifted half an inch off its foundation and refused to settle back into place. By morning, Lillian Hart was gone. Her house sat at the edge of Maple Ridge subdivision, where newer construction slowly gave way to older, more patient land, fields that did not care about property lines or human schedules. From the outside, the house looked undisturbed, almost careful in its presentation, like a stage set left intact after actors had left without warning. The front door was closed but not locked, not forced, not broken. Simply open in a way that suggested familiarity, as if whoever last touched it had no reason to believe it would remain a boundary. Inside, time had stopped in fragments. A ceramic mug rested on the kitchen counter with a brown ring dried at its base, coffee long evaporated but presence still lingering. A book lay open on the couch, spine bent, pages face down as if interrupted mid-thought. A television remote sat aligned perfectly parallel to the edge of the table, not dropped, not abandoned, but placed. Even the curtains hung in a way that felt intentional, slightly parted, allowing morning light to enter without fully revealing the room's interior, as though the house itself was unsure how much truth it was allowed to show. There were no signs of struggle that fit the language investigators expect. No overturned furniture, no shattered glass, no blood that announced itself loudly enough to guide the narrative. And that absence, more than anything, unsettled the first responders who arrived just after sunrise, still half caught between routine and instinct, expecting confusion but finding precision instead. Lillian Hart was 32 years old, a school librarian, known for predictable routines that made her life legible to others. She left for work at 7:45 every morning. She returned by 5:10 in the evening. She bought groceries on Thursdays. She paid in exact change whenever possible. She was the kind of person neighbors described as reliable, a word that in hindsight feels less like praise and more like vulnerability. On the morning she vanished, her bicycle remained locked outside the library where she worked, untouched. Her purse was found in the hallway of her home. Her car sat in the driveway, keys resting on the kitchen counter as if placed there with the assumption of return. Nothing about her disappearance resembled departure. Everything resembled interruption. Detective Raymond Cole arrived before midday, the heat already pressing down on the neighborhood like a lid being slowly lowered. He had seen missing persons cases dissolve into uncertainty before, had learned to read the difference between absence and removal. Absence leaves questions. Removal leaves residue. And this house, even in its silence, felt like something had been taken rather than lost. The first hour of investigation produced no immediate answers, only patterns of normality that refused to align into explanation. Neighbors were interviewed in clusters, their answers overlapping but never connecting in a way that created clarity. No arguments had been heard. No strangers had been seen. No vehicles that stood out. The kind of testimony that builds a wall rather than a path. Yet when Cole stepped into the backyard, something changed in his posture. The grass near the rear fence line was uneven, not dramatically disturbed, but subtly compressed, as if weight had been applied and removed with intention. The soil there was darker, recently turned, not by weather, not by animals, but by something more deliberate. He did not speak for several seconds, just observed, as though silence might offer details speech would interrupt. Beyond that fence lived Harold Vance, 58 years old, retired mechanical engineer, widowed, quiet to the point of invisibility in community perception. The kind of man whose presence is acknowledged only when necessary and forgotten immediately after. Neighbors described him with phrases that carried no accusation but no warmth either. Keeps to himself. Polite enough. Never causes trouble. Statements that sound neutral but accumulate weight over time. When investigators approached his property, Vance answered the door without delay. He did not hesitate. He did not appear surprised. He did not ask what had happened. That detail was noted, but not yet understood. His demeanor was calm, structured, almost rehearsed in its stillness. He spoke in measured sentences, each one delivered with the precision of someone accustomed to controlling variables. "I didn't hear anything unusual last night," he said. "Everything was quiet." Quiet. The word lingered longer than it should have. Because in cases like this, quiet is never just absence of sound. It is often construction. Inside his home, everything was orderly to an extent that felt engineered rather than maintained. Books aligned by height and thickness. Tools arranged with mathematical consistency. Surfaces free of clutter in a way that suggested not cleanliness, but control. Even the air felt filtered, as if disorder had been excluded rather than cleaned away. But nothing in the house provided legal justification for suspicion. No evidence of intrusion. No signs of conflict. No trace of Lillian Hart. And yet something about Vance remained unresolved in the minds of those who spoke to him, not because of what he did, but because of what he did not do. He did not express concern in the way people expect. He did not speculate. He did not offer emotion that exceeded politeness. He simply remained contained, like a system operating within acceptable parameters. By the third day, search efforts expanded beyond the neighborhood. Canine units tracked faint scent trails that dissolved near a drainage creek south of the subdivision. Volunteers combed fields and wooded edges, calling her name into spaces that offered no reply. Helicopters circled overhead, turning the landscape into geometry and heat haze. The media arrived, converting uncertainty into narrative fragments that grew sharper with repetition. Local librarian, missing without trace. Community on edge. Investigation deepens. But beneath the headlines, something more unsettling was forming. A realization that did not require evidence to exist. Whoever had taken Lillian Hart did not come from outside Willow Creek. There were no signs of forced entry that suggested a stranger. No witnesses describing unfamiliar vehicles. No digital trace of movement that pointed outward. Everything pointed inward, toward proximity, toward familiarity, toward someone who understood her life well enough to remove it without noise. Then came a detail that investigators initially set aside because it belonged to the category of ambiguity, the kind of observation that feels too small to matter until later when it becomes unbearable in hindsight. A child from 2 houses down mentions seeing a light in Harold Vance's garage at an unusual hour, sometime after 2 a.m. Not bright enough to illuminate the street, just a faint pulsing glow, intermittent, like something concealed behind layers of insulation and intent. Children are often unreliable witnesses in matters of detail but precise in matters of perception. They do not filter meaning the way adults do. They simply report what is not fit. When officers revisited Vance's property, the garage appeared unremarkable. No visible signs of late activity. No tools out of place. No lingering heat or disturbance. The door opened without resistance, revealing only organized stillness, shelving units, a workbench, neatly arranged containers. The smell of oil and metal lingered faintly, the scent of a life spent maintaining machines rather than interacting with people. Nothing actionable, nothing indictable. And so the case began its descent into the category that law enforcement dreads most. Not solved, not active, but unresolved. Weeks passed, then months. The urgency faded into procedural maintenance. Reports were filed. Leads exhausted. The file thickened, then stopped growing. Lillian Hart became a name that appeared less frequently in conversation, not because people forgot, but because repetition eventually dulls even shock. Harold Vance remained in his house. Life in Willow Creek adjusted itself around absence, as communities always do, forming new routines around unanswered questions. But beneath that adjustment, something remained unsettled, a structural imbalance that no one could fully articulate. And somewhere, buried beneath that imbalance, something waited. Not yet revealed, not yet understood, but already in motion, even if no one had the language to describe it. Because in cases like this, silence is never empty. It is occupied. The case did not die. It only changed form. In Willow Creek, Texas, cold cases did not disappear the way people liked to imagine. They didn't fade into darkness or dissolve into nothing. They settled. They layered themselves into files, into memories, into the quiet pauses between conversations. And Lillian Hart's disappearance became exactly that kind of silence. Organized, labeled, and stored away, but never truly closed. Detective Raymond Cole was reassigned within 6 months. Officially, the case remained open. Unofficially, it belonged to the category of no forward progress, the bureaucratic language used when truth refuses to reveal itself at a useful speed. The file thickened anyway, reports, interviews, soil analysis, inconsistent witness statements, but nothing inside it moved toward resolution. Only repetition. Yet Cole never fully detached. Because some details do not behave like dead ends. They behave like pressure points. And in this case, one pressure point kept returning. The neighbor. Harold Vance. At first, he had been nothing more than proximity. A man who lived next door. A man who answered questions correctly. A man whose house contained no obvious violations of logic or law. But over time, the absence of evidence around him stopped feeling neutral. It began to feel intentional. Cole revisited the initial reports again and again. Not because anything had changed, but because nothing did. And in that stillness, patterns began to form that had not been visible under urgency. Vance had not asked about Lillian Hart when officers arrived. He had not shown curiosity. Not even procedural curiosity. That detail, once dismissed, now felt like a missing emotional signature, something human behavior normally cannot omit without reason. And then came the second detail that refused to settle. The backyard soil disturbance near the fence line. It had been logged, photographed, and partially excavated during the first week. Results were inconclusive.
No body.
No immediate trace evidence, but the disturbance itself had been oddly contained, as if the activity had been measured, controlled, and deliberately limited in scope. Not chaotic disposal. Something closer to relocation. Cole requested a re-examination of the original soil samples months later. Advances in forensic processing were small but meaningful, and sometimes cold cases only move forward because science quietly catches up to what time refused to reveal. What they found did not solve a case, but it changed its shape again. Trace organic material. Degraded. Inconsistent. Not enough for identification, but enough to confirm one thing. The soil had been disturbed during a narrow time window consistent with the night of Lillian Hart's disappearance. That alone would not have been enough to reopen anything formally, but it was enough to bring Vance back into focus. And once focus returns to a subject in an unsolved case, everything around that subject begins to feel like evidence, even when it is not. In 2005, a retired forensic technician reviewed archived materials from the Hart case as part of an unrelated audit. He noticed something that had been overlooked in the original documentation: a faint, partial imprint recovered from the inside edge of the kitchen counter, likely lifted during early processing but never fully analyzed due to low-resolution technology at the time. When reprocessed, the print was incomplete but suggestive. Not definitive match material, but consistent with a male adult who had handled similar industrial materials over time: grease, solvents, mechanical residue. It was not enough to name anyone, but it was enough to narrow the invisible shape of possibility. And the shape pointed again towards someone whose life was built around mechanical precision. Harold Vance had been a mechanical engineer before retirement. That fact had been noted early and then forgotten because it felt too ordinary to matter. But now ordinariness itself began to feel suspicious, because in cold cases, what is ordinary is often what allows abnormal events to pass unnoticed. Then came the most unexpected artifact in the entire investigation: a second property. 2 streets away from Lillian Hart's home, an abandoned house had been purchased and left vacant shortly after the disappearance. At the time, it had not been considered relevant. Ownership changes in suburban developments were common, especially among investors. No one connected it to anything. But in 2010, demolition crews preparing the structure for removal discovered something beneath the basement floor. A sealed metal container. Rusted. Heavy. Intentionally concealed beneath poured concrete. Inside was a diary. Not a personal diary in the emotional sense. Not confessional. Not expressive. It was structured. Methodical. Written in precise, mechanical handwriting that mirrored engineering notes more than private thought. Dates were recorded. Times were recorded. Movements were tracked with clinical consistency. And what made it unsettling was not what it described, but how it described it. Observations of neighbors. Patterns of daily activity. Notes on lighting schedules, window usage, garbage disposal habits. Even small details like preferred walking routes and time spent outside were recorded, as if they were variables in an experiment. Lillian Hart's name appeared repeatedly. Not in emotional language. In observational structure. Subject returns at 1712. Lighting pattern consistent with isolation behavior. Predictable movement cycle confirmed. There was no explicit violence in the text. No admission. No confession. Only study. Only documentation. Only the cold accumulation of attention. But the final entry changed everything. Dated March 13th, 2002. It stopped midline. As if the author had been interrupted before completion. As if whatever came next did not need to be written down. The handwriting on that final page was slightly different. Less controlled. Slightly pressured. As if precision had begun to fail under urgency. That was the first time the investigation stopped being about disappearance and started becoming about interruption. Because now there was evidence of intent. Not direct. Not legal. But psychological. Someone had been watching Lillian Hart closely enough to map her life. And someone had been doing it from within reach. When Cole reviewed the diary copies, he noticed something that did not appear in the official report summary. A recurring spatial reference pattern. Observations written from a vantage point that consistently aligned with properties adjacent to Hart's home. Not across the street. Not distant surveillance. Adjacent. Side-by-side proximity. The kind of perspective you only get when you live next door. The kind of perspective Harold Vance had. But suspicion alone does not convict. It only deepens the absence of certainty. So investigators returned again to Vance. By this time, years had passed. He had aged slightly, but his demeanor had not changed. Still controlled. Still precise. Still measured in every sentence. When questioned again, he repeated the same structure of responses. He did not deviate. He did not elaborate. And that consistency, instead of reassuring investigators, began to feel rehearsed, like a system maintaining output stability under observation. Yet still, nothing directly linked him to Lillian Hart. No body. No forensic confirmation. No admissible confession. Only proximity. Only patterns. Only the diary. And cold cases do not move forward on patterns alone. They require rupture. The rupture, when it came, did not arrive as revelation. It arrived as a delay in demolition scheduling at the abandoned property where the diary had been found. A minor administrative pause that allowed investigators additional time on site. During that window, a second hidden compartment was discovered beneath the same foundation layer, smaller, more deliberately concealed. Inside were photographs. Not many, but enough. Lillian Hart, captured from angles that suggested distance and concealment. Some taken through windows. Some taken from exterior sightlines. None overtly illegal in isolation, but together forming a timeline of observation that spanned months. And in the background of one photograph, partially obscured by reflection in a glass surface, was a figure standing in a neighboring yard. Not clearly identifiable, but positioned in a way that aligned with known geography. Next door. The case had not yet solved itself, but it had begun to point in a single direction with increasing insistence. And in Willow Creek, silence was no longer absence. It was accumulation. And something inside that accumulation was beginning to take shape. The diary did not behave like evidence should behave. It didn't sit neatly in the case filed the way forensic reports did. It didn't settle into timelines or cleanly support a theory. Instead, it spread quietly, corrosively, through every layer of the investigation, contaminating assumptions, forcing old conclusions to reassemble themselves under new pressure. By the time Detective Raymond Cole saw the full transcription, the case had already changed identity. It was no longer a disappearance. It was a study. And Lillian Hart was no longer simply missing. She was being observed. Again. Even years after the night she vanished. The diary entries, recovered from beneath the abandoned property 2 streets away, had been digitized, cross-referenced, and analyzed for authorship patterns. Linguistic specialists noted something unsettling. The writing was not emotional, not narrative, not even confessional. It was procedural, structured like field notes. Each entry behaved like a controlled observation in an experiment where the subject was human behavior. Subject exits residence at 7:44. Deviation from routine, 2.3 minutes. Interaction with environment minimal. No names were used in most entries. Only subject. Only patterns. Only reduction. But when the name Lillian Hart appeared, the language tightened. The sentences became shorter. More precise. As if attention itself had sharpened. And then there were the entries that referred not to her movements, but to proximity. Neighbor unit active at 2:13. Unscheduled illumination detected. External observation risk minimal. That last line lingered longer than the rest in Cole's mind. External observation risk minimal. Not eliminated. Not impossible. Minimal. Which meant the author of the diary had been aware of being seen, or at least aware that being seen was unlikely. And that single assumption reframed everything, because it suggested confidence. Not panic. Not secrecy. Confidence in control. The kind of confidence that does not belong to someone improvising in the dark, but to someone operating within a system they believe they understand better than anyone else. Cole requested a behavioral reconstruction. Not of Lillian Hart. Of Harold Vance. It was a controversial move inside the department because at that stage, Vance had never been formally charged with anything. He remained a neighbor, a name adjacent to suspicion but never anchored by proof. Yet cold cases often reach a point where formal procedure begins to lag behind necessity. The reconstruction painted a life that was almost aggressively ordinary. Retired mechanical engineer. Widower. No criminal history. No financial instability. No recorded conflicts with neighbors. No known deviations. But that last word, deviation, became the problem. Because absence of deviation is not proof of innocence. It is only absence of recorded failure. And the diary suggested something else entirely. Not randomness, not impulse, but consistency. Patterns observed over time. Behavior mapped like machinery. Meanwhile, the physical evidence from the abandoned house continued to resist closure. The photographs recovered beneath the basement floor were enhanced repeatedly, each pass revealing slightly more detail, but never enough to resolve certainty. Lillian Hart appeared in multiple frames, sometimes alone, sometimes partially obscured by window frames or reflections. The angles were wrong for casual photography. Too deliberate. Too stable. They were taken from fixed positions over time, which meant planning, which meant repetition, which meant return. But what unsettled Cole most was not what the images showed, but what they implied about the observer's location. Every confirmed vantage point aligned with one consistent spatial relationship, adjacency. Side-by-side property lines. Backyards separated only by fences. Distances measured in steps, not streets. And in Willow Creek, there was only one residence that consistently matched that geometry. Harold Vance's house. When investigators returned to his property for the third formal interview, they did so with a different energy. Not accusation yet. Not arrest. But something heavier than curiosity. The kind of attention that begins to bend the atmosphere in a room before a word is spoken. Vance answered the door, as he always did.
Calm. Composed.
Predictable. That predictability, once seen as stability, now began to feel like insulation. Inside his home, nothing had changed. The same arrangement, the same order, the same controlled absence of disorder. Even time seemed reluctant to disturb the symmetry of the space. Detectives asked him again about the night of March 13, 2002. He answered without hesitation. I was home. I didn't hear anything unusual. No variation. No additional detail. No emotional weight. And then came the question that had not been asked in earlier interviews. Do you remember Lillian Hart? A pause. Not long. Not dramatic. But precise. I knew of her, Vance said. She lived next door. Knew of her. Not knew her. Not spoke with her. Not interacted. Just knew of her. As if she had been an object in his environment rather than a person in his proximity. That distinction was noted. It would matter later. But still, there was nothing that could be acted upon legally. No confession. No direct evidence. No physical link that survived courtroom standards. Only reconstruction. Only inference. Only pattern convergence. And patterns in legal systems are not enough. So the case stalled again. But stagnation does not mean inactivity. It only means movement has shifted somewhere out of sight. In the months that followed, forensic linguists continued analyzing the diary. One detail emerged late, almost accidentally. The handwriting across earlier entries was consistent, but the final pages, those closest to March 13th, showed subtle changes. Pressure variations, irregular spacing, slight tremor in stroke consistency. Stress indicators. Not emotional collapse, but interruption of control. Something had disrupted the system. Something had entered the space that was not accounted for. And then the final entry became the focal point again. Dated March 13th, 2002. Cut mid-sentence. No closure. No completion. Just. Subject observed approaching perimeter at. Nothing after that. As if the observation itself had been interrupted by the thing it was trying to describe. Cole began to reconstruct the timeline minute by minute. Evening hours. neighborhoods settling into routine, lights turning off sequentially like a programmed shutdown. Lillian Hart's last confirmed activity, returning home shortly after 1710. Bicycle locked at library earlier that day. No deviations. Then a gap. A narrow gap. The kind that only exists when no one is watching closely enough. And in that gap, something moved. Or someone did. Investigators revisited environmental data. Light pollution maps. Power usage logs. Nothing definitive emerged, but one anomaly appeared in historical electrical fluctuations, a brief, localized surge around 2:13 a.m. in the vicinity of Maple Ridge subdivision. Too small to indicate major activity, too specific to ignore. It matched the child's earlier statement about a light in a garage. The child had described it as pulsing, intermittent, like something hidden. At this stage, the investigation was no longer linear. It was layered. Every new piece of data did not replace the old. It stacked on top of it, creating density instead of clarity. And in that density, Harold Vance remained at the center. Not proven, not cleared, simply present. And presence in cold cases is sometimes the most dangerous form of evidence, because it does not decay. It accumulates. And in Willow Creek, accumulation was beginning to feel like inevitability. The case should have collapsed under its own contradictions. That is what usually happens when time stretches too far over a missing person investigation. Witnesses fade, physical evidence degrades, theories multiply until none of them can carry weight. But Lillian Hart's disappearance refused that natural decay. Instead, it hardened, like something preserved under pressure, like something waiting for the right force to crack it open. By the time the diary was fully integrated into the official case file, it no longer functioned as a single artifact. It had become a framework, one that investigators kept building around, even when they could not legally stand on it. And Harold Vance, still living in the same house on Maple Ridge's edge, remained the fixed point everything kept orbiting. No arrest. No charges. Only proximity. Only repetition. Only patterns that refused to resolve into proof. But something had changed in the way Detective Raymond Cole approached the file. It was no longer just professional. It had become architectural. He wasn't asking what happened anymore. He was asking how something could happen so cleanly that nothing in the system registered it as violence. And the answer, buried in the diary and the fragments of environmental data, was becoming uncomfortably simple. Because everything had been observed in advance. The diary was not just a record. It was preparation. Each entry mapped routine with mechanical precision, Lillian Hart's departure times, her return window, the exact duration of her lights being on at night. Even the cadence of her habits had been reduced into measurable units. The language of it was what disturbed the forensic linguists most. Not emotional obsession, but engineered attention. One analyst wrote in the margin of her report, "This reads like calibration." Calibration implied adjustment. Adjustment implied control. And control implied proximity. The photographs found in the abandoned house 2 streets away were re-examined under higher resolution imaging software, the kind that did not exist at the time of the original investigation. What emerged was not new evidence in the traditional sense, but refinement of existing uncertainty. Reflections in windows that previously looked like glare now resolved into partial silhouettes. Angles of capture that suggested the photographer was not hiding in distant surveillance positions, but operating within a stable, repeatable line of sight. Always lateral. Always adjacent. Always consistent with a neighbor's perspective. Cole began to map the spatial geometry himself, pinning the images to a reconstructed layout of Maple Ridge subdivision as it existed in 2002. When he overlaid sight lines, something disturbing became visually obvious without needing interpretation. The majority of confirmed photographic angles intersected in a narrow band of adjacency between 2 properties. One of them belonged to Lillian Hart, the other to Harold Vance. That was the first time the case stopped feeling like a mystery and started feeling like a structure. Not chaotic, not random, structured. But structure in investigative terms is not enough. Structure is only meaningful when it produces traceable action. And so far, Everything remained one step short of that threshold. No body had ever been recovered. No direct forensic link had been extracted from Vance's residence. No confession had ever been made. And without one of those three pillars, the entire framework risked remaining speculative, no matter how tightly it held together. Then came the renewed excavation order. The backyard soil disturbance, originally documented in the first week of the investigation years earlier, had never been fully explored due to jurisdictional limitations and lack of immediate forensic yield. But with the diary resurfacing and renewed judicial interest in cold case reclassification protocols, permission was finally granted for a deeper dig. The backyard of Lillian Hart's home had not changed much in appearance over the years. Grass had grown back unevenly over the original disturbance zone, but even nature could not erase the subtle asymmetry of ground that had once been altered deliberately. When excavation began, the team worked slowly, methodically, stripping layers of soil with a careful patience reserved for cases where expectation is low but consequence is high. For the first several hours, nothing emerged. Then the soil composition changed. Not dramatically, but noticeably. A denser layer beneath the topsoil, compacted in a way that suggested either prior disturbance or compression from sustained weight. Forensic archaeologists paused at that level. Soil stratification was consistent with previous reports, but something about the uniformity of compaction suggested not natural settling, but applied pressure. One of the technicians described it simply: "It doesn't look like nature did this." They extended the excavation radius. Still nothing definitive. No remains. No clothing. No clear physical trace of Lillian Hart. But what they did recover changed the direction of the investigation again in a more subtle, more psychological way. A fragment of plastic. Weathered. Almost indistinguishable from surrounding debris. Recovered near the deepest layer of disturbed soil. Initial analysis suggested it was part of a household object, possibly a storage container, possibly a tool casing. The kind of object that would not be inherently suspicious unless placed in context. And context was exactly what the case had become. Meanwhile, Harold Vance's daily life remained unchanged on the surface. Neighbors still described him in the same neutral language. Quiet, reserved, keeps to himself. But now those descriptions carried a different tone in official reports. Neutrality had begun to feel like avoidance. Investigators revisited his interview transcripts again and again, not for new information, but for inconsistencies in absence. There were none. His statements were too consistent, too stable across time. Even emotional references remained unchanged. He did not fluctuate. And that, paradoxically, began to feel like instability of another kind. Because human memory degrades. Human emotion shifts. But Vance did neither, at least not in any recorded interaction. Then a breakthrough emerged from a completely unrelated direction. A retired postal inspector reviewing old delivery anomalies in the region noticed a pattern of undelivered or rerouted mail entries associated with addresses near Maple Ridge during the months leading up to March 2002. Not enough to suggest systemic interference, but enough to suggest irregularity in local routing behavior. Among those entries was correspondence addressed to Lillian Hart that had been marked as delivered, no signature required, despite requiring confirmation in standard protocol. A procedural anomaly. Small, but meaningful when placed alongside everything else. Because it suggested something simple and devastating. Someone had been controlling not just observation, but information flow. Cole began to see the case differently after that point. It was no longer about a single act. It was about access. Access to timing. Access to movement. Access to knowledge. And access, in this context, was spatial. It required closeness. The kind of closeness that does not raise suspicion because it is embedded in normal life. A neighbor checking the mail. A neighbor mowing the lawn. A neighbor existing at the boundary of visibility. Harold Vance existed exactly there. And then came the detail that finally broke the investigative rhythm. A second review of the diary revealed something previously overlooked. A repeated phrase that appeared intermittently throughout the entries, always at the margins of observation notes. Within expected range. It was used to describe everything. Lighting patterns, movement behavior, noise levels, even absence itself. Everything was within expected range, which meant nothing about Lillian Hart's life had been unpredictable to the observer. Nothing had surprised them. Until the final entry. The one that ended mid-sentence. The one that coincided with the night she vanished. The implication was no longer subtle. Something had changed in that final moment. Something had entered the expected range that was not accounted for. Cole stared at that phrase longer than any other line in the file, because it suggested a system that only fails when it encounters something it cannot categorize. And whatever happened on March 13th into the early hours of March 14th, 2002, had done exactly that. Not broken the system. Interrupted it. And in Willow Creek, interruption was the closest thing to a confession the case had ever produced. The interruption the diary hinted at became the center of everything, not because it explained the disappearance of Lillian Hart, but because it suggested something even more disturbing, that the system behind her observation had not simply ended, but had been disrupted mid-operation, like a machine that stops not from failure, but from contact with something it was never designed to register. Detective Raymond Cole could no longer look at the case file without seeing that fracture point. March 13, 2002 was no longer just a date. It had become a boundary line between control and collapse, between observation and whatever came after observation ended. The diary entries before that night were stable, repetitive, almost soothing in their mechanical precision. Timestamps, behavioral notes, environmental consistency reports. The language was stripped of personality, reduced to measurable phenomena. But after that final broken sentence, subject observed approaching perimeter at. There was nothing. No continuation. No conclusion. Only absence. And absence, in this case, felt active. As if something had stopped the writer before completion. Or forced them to stop. The forensic linguists revisited the handwriting analysis again, focusing specifically on the final pages. Under magnification, they noticed a subtle but consistent change in stroke pressure near the end of the diary. Not random variation. Not fatigue. Something more abrupt. The ink flow became inconsistent in the last recorded lines, suggesting either environmental disruption or psychological stress at the exact moment of writing. One analyst described it in the report as loss of controlled continuity. Cole didn't like that phrase, because it implied awareness being interrupted, not fading. Interrupted. The difference mattered. Meanwhile, Harold Vance remained unchanged in every official record. No financial anomalies. No sudden behavioral shifts. No traceable movements outside his property during the critical window that could be proven beyond doubt. Every attempt to reconstruct his timeline on March 13th into March 14th resulted in the same conclusion. He was at home. Present. Unremarkable. And unprovable. But investigators had stopped expecting direct contradictions. They had begun looking for structural impossibilities instead. That shift changed the nature of the investigation entirely. It was no longer about what Vance did. It was about what would have been required for everything else to remain so undisturbed. The second phase of excavation at Lillian Hart's backyard produced no human remains, but it did produce something more psychologically destabilizing, a spatial pattern in the soil composition that suggested repeated compression events over time. Not a single disturbance. Multiple. That detail altered the entire interpretation of the site. If the soil had been compressed more than once, then activity had not been isolated to a single night, which meant observation was not the only behavior in play. There was repetition, and repetition implies return. The question that followed was immediate and unavoidable. Return by whom? At the same time, digital reconstruction teams working with enhanced mapping software began modeling sightlines across Maple Ridge subdivision. The goal was simple in theory: determine who could see what and from where during the relevant time window. But what emerged was anything but simple. When simulated nighttime conditions were applied and ambient lighting conditions reconstructed from 2002 utility data, a narrow but consistent visual corridor appeared between Lillian Hart's rear windows and the adjacent property line. Harold Vance's house. Not direct visibility from interior rooms alone, but from specific angles within his property perimeter, particularly the garage and a side yard vantage point that had been dismissed earlier as irrelevant. But now it wasn't irrelevant, because the diary had referenced intermittent light sources at 2:13 a.m. And the simulation showed that at that exact time range, a brief external illumination could have been visible from Hart's backyard if it originated from that corridor. The child witness statement suddenly re-entered the case with new weight. A pulsing light. Not constant. Not ambient. Intermittent. Cole requested a re-interview of the now-adult witness, but the individual had moved out of state years earlier. The statement remained archived, unverified, but now recontextualized. The case was no longer built on new evidence. It was built on old evidence becoming newly aligned. Then came a development that shifted the tone of the entire investigation again. A maintenance worker who had briefly assisted in securing the abandoned property where the diary was found came forward with an additional detail he had not included in his initial statement years earlier. At the time, he had assumed it was irrelevant. He described hearing a faint mechanical sound beneath the basement floor during early inspection work before demolition began. Not loud, not identifiable, but rhythmic, like something cycling on and off beneath the concrete. He had dismissed it as plumbing or structural settling. But now, with the diary's structured observations and references to timed environmental activity, that memory took on a different weight. Cole asked for a re-examination of the basement structure. The demolition site had long since been cleared, but archived ground-penetrating radar data still existed. When reanalyzed with updated interpretation algorithms, the scans revealed something subtle beneath the original concrete layer, a secondary void space that had not been fully documented at the time. Not large, not easily accessible, but intentional. A concealed compartment. Empty now, but constructed deliberately, which raised a question that no one wanted to articulate directly. What had it been used for? The diary did not answer that question. It only implied continuity between observation and action, between recording and physical manipulation of environment. And Lillian Hart remained the central reference point across both domains. At this stage, Harold Vance's identity in the case file had shifted from neighbor of interest to something more abstract in internal notes: primary spatial correlate. It was a bureaucratic phrase designed to avoid accusation while acknowledging pattern dominance. But in practice, it meant something simpler. Everything pointed toward him, without yet being able to touch him. Then Cole noticed something buried in the earliest interview transcripts that had been overlooked for years. A small inconsistency in language. When first asked about Lillian Hart in 2002, Vance had said, "I knew of her. She lived next door." But in a later follow-up statement 6 months after the disappearance, he said something slightly different. "She lived beside me." Not much on its own. But in linguistic analysis, relational framing matters. Knew of her implies distance. She lived beside me implies spatial acknowledgement. Not emotional connection, but positional awareness. And positional awareness, in this case, was everything. Because the entire case depended on proximity being not just physical, but informational. That realization led Cole back to the diary again. And this time, he noticed something he had not focused on before. A recurring notation system embedded in the margins of several entries. Small symbols. Repetitive marks. Initially assumed to be organizational shorthand or personal indexing. But when cataloged and compared, they formed a pattern aligned with temporal intervals. Not random. Structured. Like a schedule. Like a watch system. As if the writer had been tracking not just behavior, but readiness. Cole stared at those symbols for a long time before he wrote the conclusion that he knew would never appear in a formal charging document. Not yet. But it appeared in his private notes. Subject was not only observed. Subject was scheduled. And once that idea entered the case, everything changed shape again. Because scheduling implies intent before action. And intent, in this investigation, had been present long before the night Lillian Hart disappeared. Which meant the disappearance itself was not the beginning of the story. It was the execution of something already in motion. And somewhere in Willow Creek, Texas, that motion had started long before anyone realized they were watching it unfold. By the time the word scheduled appeared in Detective Raymond Cole's private notes, the investigation had already stopped behaving like a conventional cold case. It had become something denser, less procedural, more psychological in its structure. Every new layer of evidence did not clarify what had happened to Lillian Hart. It only refined the sense that what happened had been prepared long before anyone realized preparation was underway. And preparation, in this case, had a rhythm. A measured one. A controlled one. The kind that does not belong to panic or impulse, but to repetition. The diary from beneath the abandoned house had already established that rhythm. But what investigators had not fully accepted until now was that the rhythm extended beyond observation. It implied anticipation. It implied timing. It implied that whoever wrote those entries was not reacting to Lillian Hart's life, but aligning themselves with it. Cole returned again to the earliest entries, not looking for content, but for structure. The language was still clinical, still stripped of emotion, but something subtle had begun to emerge under repeated analysis. Intervals. The entries were not just descriptions of behavior. They were spaced with consistency that suggested monitoring windows rather than spontaneous documentation. Every observation seemed to occur within a predictable cycle. Morning activity. Afternoon stabilization. Evening return. And then a gap. Always a gap. The gap had no entries, no commentary, no deviation logs. It was simply absence inside structure, and that absence became increasingly significant the more it was studied. Because absence, when scheduled, is not silence. It is expectation. Meanwhile, Harold Vance's life continued unchanged on the surface. He was seen occasionally by neighbors, tending to his yard, retrieving mail, performing the rituals of suburban invisibility. The kind of routines that blend into background noise so completely that they stop registering as behavior. But investigators had begun to notice something new in witness recollections. Not what he did, but how consistently he was present at predictable times. He was never absent in ways that could be verified. Never missing during structured observation periods. Never outside expected range. That phrase again. Expected range. It had appeared in the diary repeatedly, but now it began to feel less like descriptive language and more like operational language. As if someone had defined a boundary of normalcy and was actively maintaining it. Cole requested a full temporal alignment reconstruction using utility data, traffic patterns, and local noise reports from March 13th to March 14th, 2002. The goal was to determine whether any environmental anomalies coincided with the diary's final entry window. What the reconstruction revealed was not dramatic. It was worse than dramatic. It was precise. At approximately 2:10 a.m., there was a localized electrical fluctuation within Maple Ridge subdivision. Not large enough to trigger system-wide alerts, but consistent with a short-duration external load being activated and deactivated within a narrow window. 2 minutes later, the fluctuation repeated, then stopped, then never occurred again. The pattern matched intermittent usage. Not continuous activity. Not sustained disruption. Controlled activation. And that control implied intent. The forensic team overlaid this data with the diary's final entry timestamp. Subject observed approaching perimeter at. The interruption occurred within the same temporal window, which meant something critical. The diary's author had been actively recording at the exact moment environmental conditions changed. Not before. Not after. During. Cole began to reconsider the nature of the diary itself. It was no longer simply a record of observation. It was a synchronized document, aligned with real-world events in a way that suggested proximity to the subject being observed. Too precise to be remote. Too consistent to be incidental. Which brought the investigation back, again, to adjacency. Back to Harold Vance's property. Back to spatial possibility. Back to the question that could not be answered directly, only inferred. What level of proximity would allow for that degree of synchronized observation? The answer remained uncomfortable. Close enough to see. Close enough to react. Close enough to interrupt. But still, No physical evidence tied Vance to any direct action. The system of law demanded more than alignment. It demanded contact. It demanded traceability. And despite years of analysis, excavation, and reconstruction, that threshold had not been crossed. That is when a second linguistic anomaly in the diary gained importance. A phrase that had previously been dismissed as internal shorthand. Subject entering expected deviation zone. At first, analysts assumed it referred to behavioral deviation, Lillian Hart stepping outside routine. But when cross-referenced with spatial modeling, it appeared that deviation zone correlated not with behavior, but with physical movement outside a defined perimeter of visibility from the observer's assumed vantage point. In simpler terms, it was not about what she did. It was about where she could no longer be reliably seen. And that distinction reframed everything again, because it suggested that the observer's primary concern was not interaction. It was continuity of sight. Cole felt the case tightening around a single conceptual point: visibility as control. If Lillian Hart's life had been mapped in such detail, then her disappearance could have been timed not only with her routine, but with a break in observational certainty. The moment she left the expected range. And once she left that range, she became something else. Not unobserved, but uncontained. Investigators revisited Harold Vance's garage once more, this time with advanced scanning equipment capable of detecting historical environmental residues. The structure itself revealed nothing overtly criminal. No hidden compartments. No visible modifications. But beneath the floor near the rear wall, sensors detected minor inconsistencies in material density. Not enough to indicate a tunnel or chamber, but enough to suggest repeated localized activity at some point in the past. Not excavation. Not construction. Disturbance. Repeated disturbance in a confined area. And again, the pattern of repetition returned. The case was no longer asking what happened once. It was asking what had been practiced. Meanwhile, a separate forensic review of the diary's ink composition revealed something subtle but significant. The ink in the final pages differed slightly in chemical composition from earlier entries. Not enough to suggest a different author, but enough to suggest a different environment of writing. Different conditions. Possibly different location. Possibly interruption. Possibly movement during writing. Cole stared at that finding for a long time, because it implied something no one wanted to say out loud. The diary may not have been written in a fixed, safe location. It may have been written under conditions of transition. And transition implies action occurring simultaneously with documentation, which meant the observer was not outside the event. They were inside it. That realization shifted the emotional weight of the investigation again. What had started as surveillance had begun to resemble participation. Not necessarily in the legal sense, but in the structural sense, presence within the unfolding sequence. And Lillian Hart's disappearance stopped feeling like an isolated incident. It began to feel like the final entry in a process that had already been running for a long time. Cole closed the file that night and wrote one final line in his private notes. If she was scheduled, then the system that scheduled her was already active before March 13th. He did not sleep after writing it, because the implication was unavoidable. If the system existed before the disappearance, then Lillian Hart was never the first subject of it. She was simply the one whose interruption made the system visible. And somewhere in Willow Creek, Texas, that system had once been operating in plain sight, hidden only by its own consistency. And consistency in cases like this is never innocence. It is concealment that has never been forced to change. By the time the investigation reached its 7th phase, no one in the unit still referred to it as a missing person case in casual conversation. Even the language had shifted under the weight of accumulated material. It had become something else entirely, an observational reconstruction, a forensic narrative built backward from absence. And at the center of that reconstruction remained the same unresolved tension. Everything pointed toward Harold Vance, yet nothing in the legal framework could yet anchor him to what happened to Lillian Hart. That contradiction had begun to shape the psychology of the case team itself. Not frustration in the usual sense, but a kind of narrowing focus, as if all investigative paths were slowly converging toward a point that could be seen but not touched. Detective Raymond Cole felt it most sharply when reviewing the timeline overlays late at night in the station, the rest of the building silent, fluorescent lights humming faintly like an artificial nervous system refusing to sleep. On his screen, the reconstructed map of Maple Ridge subdivision flickered between layers: utility data, witness reports, diary entries, photographic sightlines. Everything aligned too well. Not in the way truth usually aligns, with gaps and contradictions that need reconciliation, but in a way that felt engineered. And that was the word that kept returning to him. Engineered. Because nothing about the pattern felt organic anymore. It felt assembled. The diary had become the spine of that structure. Every entry reinforced the same conceptual framework: observation as discipline, routine as control, deviation as monitored exception. Lillian Hart's life had been reduced to measurable intervals long before she vanished. But what troubled Cole most was not the precision of that mapping. It was the implication that the mapping itself required proximity that could not be maintained without physical closeness, which meant the observer was not distant. They were embedded. The forensic linguists had refined their interpretation again. A new internal report circulated within the task group reclassified the diary not as surveillance documentation, but as behavioral synchronization log. The terminology mattered because it shifted the perceived intent from passive watching to active alignment. Synchronization implied response. Response implied awareness of change in real time. And real-time awareness implied presence. Physical presence. The kind that exists next door. Harold Vance's house, once just a background structure in the investigation, had now become the gravitational center of all reconstructed data. Every mapped sightline, every environmental anomaly, every temporal irregularity intersected within or near his property boundary. Yet still, no direct evidence existed that could survive courtroom scrutiny. That gap between convergence and admissibility was where the case stalled repeatedly. And it was beginning to affect the investigators in subtle but measurable ways. Sleep patterns disrupted, repeated review cycles, an increasing tendency to recheck already confirmed data as if repetition itself might produce a new result. Cole noticed it in himself as well. He found himself returning to the same frames of the photographs recovered from the abandoned house, zooming into corners of reflections, shadow edges, background distortions, looking for something that had not been visible before. And sometimes, in the margins of uncertainty, he convinced himself he saw movement where none had been confirmed. That was the danger of long cold cases. They begin to occupy perception as much as logic. A second wave of analysis focused on Harold Vance's daily life patterns in 2002, reconstructed through utility usage logs, mail delivery records, and neighbor recollections. What emerged was a profile of extreme consistency. Not just routine consistency, but temporal rigidity. Lights on and off at precise intervals. Minimal deviation in external activity. Predictability that bordered on architectural. One analyst remarked privately, "It's like he was maintaining a schedule that had nothing to do with him." That comment was never included in the official report. But it lingered, because it suggested something deeply unsettling. That Vance's behavior might not have been shaped by convenience or habit, but by external alignment. As if his life was structured around something happening nearby, something requiring his presence to remain within certain boundaries. And that brought the investigation back again to visibility. Because everything in the diary, everything in the spatial reconstruction, kept returning to the same principle. Observation was directional. It required a fixed vantage point, a consistent line of sight. And consistency of sight requires physical anchoring. The abandoned house where the diary was found was re-examined again, this time focusing on its basement structure and spatial relationship to surrounding properties. A new 3D reconstruction revealed something previously overlooked: a narrow alignment corridor between the basement's original foundation and the backyards of adjacent homes. Not a tunnel, not access, but a line of minimal obstruction. A line that would allow intermittent observation under specific conditions. When plotted against historical lighting conditions and known movement patterns of Lillian Hart, the corridor aligned with multiple diary entries, especially those marked with irregular notation symbols. The symbols, once assumed to be organizational marks, were now reinterpreted as temporal indicators, points of heightened attention, moments where observation intensity increased. And those moments consistently aligned with times when Lillian Hart was at home alone. Evening hours, late night transitions, the vulnerable windows of routine life. Cole began to understand the structure differently now. It was not surveillance in the traditional sense. It was timing, not watching everything, watching only the moments that mattered, which implied knowledge of routine at a level too precise for casual observation. The investigation team attempted once more to reconstruct how such knowledge could be acquired without direct interaction. They considered mail interception, long-term casual observation, even indirect social mapping through third parties. But every model eventually collapsed under the same constraint: too much precision. To know someone that well, you had to live close enough for long enough that their life stopped being external data and became environmental noise you naturally absorbed. Which brought the analysis back, inevitably, to adjacency, to the house next door, to Harold Vance. Meanwhile, a renewed forensic examination of the soil samples from Lillian Hart's backyard revealed something unexpected in the mineral composition at deeper layers. Trace metallic residues inconsistent with natural soil formation patterns. Not enough to indicate industrial contamination, but enough to suggest repeated contact with tools or materials not typically present in residential gardening environments. It was not a breakthrough, but it was another layer, another reinforcement of disturbance. And disturbance, in this case, was never random. It was structured. Then came the most psychologically destabilizing finding yet. A reprocessed audio fragment recovered from a neighbor's personal security system, initially dismissed as background noise, was enhanced using modern filtering techniques. What emerged was not a clear recording, but a faint, rhythmic mechanical sound occurring intermittently during the early morning hours of March 14, 2002, the same time window as the diary's interruption. The sound was not identifiable as any standard household appliance. It was too irregular for HVAC systems, too subdued for machinery operation, too structured for environmental noise. One analyst described it as controlled activation cycles. The phrase triggered immediate reevaluation of earlier assumptions. Controlled cycles, like something being turned on and off deliberately, not continuously running, but engaged in intervals. Cole listened to the audio repeatedly until the pattern began to imprint itself into his perception. Not loud, not dramatic, but persistent in its structure. And in that repetition, the case began to feel less like a mystery and more like a mechanism that had been operating within the neighborhood without recognition, until the moment it stopped, or was interrupted. The final realization of that phase did not come from new evidence, but from synthesis. Cole merged diary timestamps, environmental anomalies, and reconstructed sightlines into a single composite timeline. And when the layers aligned, a single disturbing structure emerged: observation, anticipation, interruption, and absence. For stages, not random, sequential. And at the center of that sequence consistently was one location: Harold Vance's property. But even now, even with all layers converging, the system still lacked its final element: proof. And without proof, even perfect alignment remains only theory, which meant the case was still not finished. It was only becoming clearer where it had always been pointing. By the time the investigation reached its 8th phase, the word theory had begun to feel almost insulting inside the task unit. Not because anyone had abandoned caution, but because caution no longer fit the shape of what they were seeing. Every layer added to the Lillian Hart case had reduced uncertainty in one direction only, toward convergence. And yet convergence, without admissibility, was a kind of paralysis the system was not designed to resolve. Detective Raymond Cole understood that better than anyone now. He could feel the structure of the case tightening around a central absence, like a net drawn slowly inward without ever touching the thing it was meant to catch. The diary, the soil disturbance, the environmental anomalies, the synchronized timelines, they no longer behaved like separate pieces of evidence. They behaved like components of a single mechanism that had been partially reconstructed but never fully observed in operation. And at the center of that mechanism remained Harold Vance. Still uncharged, still unbroken by the legal system, still living in the same house on Maple Ridge, as if the last 20 years had passed around him rather than through him. The renewed forensic review of the diary had shifted focus again, this time away from content and toward structure. Analysts began treating the entries not as narrative logs, but as system outputs. When viewed through that lens, the repetition of observational patterns took on a different meaning entirely. It was no longer just surveillance, it resembled calibration cycles. Each entry followed a consistent operational rhythm: observe, record, confirm stability, note deviation potential, return to baseline. It was mechanical in its consistency, almost ritualistic in its repetition. But what disturbed the forensic linguists most was not the structure itself. It was the precision of interruption points. Every few pages, the pattern broke slightly. Entries that ended abruptly or contained incomplete observational cycles, as if the recording process had been interrupted mid-execution. These breaks were rare, but consistent enough to form their own secondary pattern. And when those interruptions were mapped against the final entry dated March 13, 2002, they aligned with a disturbing implication. Interruption was not an anomaly in the system. It was part of it. Cole requested a full behavioral simulation based on reconstructed diary cycles. The goal was to determine whether the observation pattern reflected passive monitoring or active engagement. The simulation produced a result that no one initially wanted to present in official briefing language. The system did not behave like observation. It behaved like expectation management. In other words, it was not simply recording what Lillian Hart did. It was anticipating what she was about to do. That distinction changed everything. Because anticipation requires temporal proximity. It requires awareness of routine at a level where deviation can be predicted before it manifests. And prediction at that level is not possible from distant surveillance alone. It requires embedded observation. Physical closeness. The kind that only adjacency can provide. Meanwhile, a separate forensic team revisited the spatial reconstruction models using upgraded environmental simulation software. When they reran the visual corridor analysis between properties in Maple Ridge, they introduced a new variable, reflective night conditions, based on seasonal atmospheric humidity data from March 2002. The result was subtle but significant. Under those conditions, visibility between adjacent properties increased slightly during specific hours, particularly when interior lighting was used in otherwise darkened homes. This meant that brief silhouettes, movements, or even light pulses inside one residence could be partially observable from the neighboring property under the right conditions. Not continuously, not clearly, but intermittently. And intermittency, in this case, matched the diary's pattern of observational notation. The convergence was becoming harder to ignore. Still, investigators needed something more concrete than alignment. They needed traceable action, something that could survive cross-examination. But the case continued to resist that final step, as if it existed in a space just outside the reach of formal evidence. Then a breakthrough came from an unexpected source, a reanalysis of telecommunications infrastructure logs from the early 2000s. At the time of Lillian Hart's disappearance, local landline routing data had not been preserved in high resolution. But partial recovery from archived carrier records revealed a brief, but unusual pattern of signal activity spikes localized within the Maple Ridge exchange cluster during the early morning hours of March 14th. The spikes were not consistent with normal call traffic. They were too brief, too synchronized, too structured. Engineers reviewing the data described them as activation pulses, consistent with short-duration device engagement or repeated switching of electrical systems within a confined network loop. When mapped temporally, These pulses aligned with both the diary interruption point and the environmental fluctuation previously identified at approximately 2:10 to 2:15 a.m. 3 independent data streams, all converging on the same narrow window. Cole stared at that alignment for a long time before speaking. Because alignment at that level does not suggest coincidence. It suggests coordination. And coordination implies presence. At this point, Harold Vance was no longer just a suspect in the traditional sense. He had become something closer to a structural constant in the case, an anchor point around which all anomalous data seemed to organize itself. Yet legally, he remained untouched. The absence of direct forensic linkage continued to shield him within procedural boundaries. That gap between structural certainty and legal admissibility was beginning to affect the investigation's internal dynamics. Some analysts began to refer privately to the case as pre-solved but unprovable. Others stopped discussing it altogether outside formal settings. Cole did neither. Instead, he returned again to the earliest witness statements, searching not for new information, but for overlooked phrasing. And that is when he noticed something that had been present since the beginning, but never weighted properly. Multiple neighbors, when describing Harold Vance in 2002, had used similar language, without coordination. He was always there. He never seemed to be away. You'd see him at the same times every day. At the time, those statements had been categorized as typical suburban familiarity bias. But now, in the context of controlled observation patterns, they took on a different meaning. Consistency of presence. Not social description. Temporal certainty, which meant Vance was not only visible in the neighborhood. He was reliably visible. And reliability of presence is not a neutral trait in a case defined by precise timing. It becomes functional, a stabilizing condition within an observational system. Cole began to see the possibility forming, slowly and uncomfortably, that Vance's role in the environment may not have been incidental at all, that his presence next door could have functioned as a fixed observational baseline, something constant enough to measure deviations against. If that were true, then Lillian Hart's life had not only been observed, it had been measured relative to him. The diary suddenly made more sense in a way that was far more unsettling than before. It was not simply tracking her behavior. It was comparing it against a fixed spatial reference point. And that reference point had always been adjacent. That realization shifted the emotional tone of the investigation again. It was no longer about pursuit. It was about proximity as structure. About the idea that someone's ordinary life could function as the backbone of someone else's systematic observation. Then came the final development of this phase, a partial reconstruction of Vance's property layout using archival land survey data from the late 1990s. When overlaid with diary observational vectors, investigators discovered something previously unnoticed. A specific window alignment. From a side room in Vance's house, there was a narrow line of sight toward the rear portion of Lillian Hart's home under certain lighting conditions. It was not a direct, obvious view. It required angle, timing, and environmental conditions to align correctly. But it existed. And more importantly, it matched the diary's intermittent visibility structure. Cole wrote nothing in his official report that night. But in his private notes, he wrote a single line. This was never about distance. It was about windows of certainty. And for the first time since the case began, the structure no longer felt like it was approaching resolution. It felt like it had already happened once. And everything since then had been what remained after interruption. By the time the 9th phase of the investigation began, there was no longer any meaningful separation between evidence and interpretation. The Lillian Hart case had evolved into something heavier than both, a reconstructed system built from fragments that refused to behave like fragments. Every piece, no matter how small, insisted on pointing back to the same fixed geometry, adjacency, timing, interruption, and control of visibility. And at the center of that geometry, unchanged in position if not in implication, was Harold Vance. Still never charged. Still never directly linked. Still structurally unavoidable. Detective Raymond Cole no longer approached the case as something to be solved in the traditional sense. It had become an exercise in containment of understanding. The more clearly the pattern emerged, the more unstable it felt to articulate it within the limits of formal procedure. Because the truth, if it could be called that, did not exist as a single event. It existed as alignment, a synchronization of ordinary systems that, when viewed together, stopped looking ordinary. The final reconstruction of the diary was completed in a secure forensic environment. By now, it was no longer treated as a narrative artifact, but as a synchronized observational record. Analysts mapped every entry against environmental data, witness statements, and reconstructed spatial modeling of Maple Ridge subdivision. What emerged was not new information. It was structure confirmation. The diary did not simply record Lillian Hart's life. It tracked her in relation to a fixed observational anchor point. Every entry, every timestamp, every note of deviation or stability referenced not just her behavior, but her behavior within a spatial framework that only made sense if the observer's position remained constant. And that constant position aligned, repeatedly, with one property, Harold Vance's house. But the most disturbing realization came not from the completed entries, but from the pattern of interruption itself. The diary structure showed that observational intensity increased during predictable intervals, then abruptly collapsed at a single point, the night of March 13th into March 14th, 2002. That collapse was not random. It was absolute. No further entries. No continuation. No recovery of structure. Just termination. As if the system had encountered an event it could no longer process. Cole sat with that conclusion longer than any other part of the investigation, because it implied something the legal system could not easily translate into charges, that whatever happened that night was not an isolated action, but a system failure event within a controlled observational framework. And systems do not fail without cause. They fail when their conditions change. Meanwhile, the spatial reconstruction team finalized the most detailed model yet of Maple Ridge subdivision as it existed in 2002. When all variables were combined, lighting conditions, building materials, seasonal atmospheric data, and known behavioral patterns of residents, the simulation produced a narrow but persistent phenomenon. There were moments during the evening and early morning hours when visibility between specific points in adjacent properties increased just enough to allow partial observation of movement inside Lillian Hart's home. Not full visibility, not clarity, but detection-level visibility. The kind of intermittent awareness that does not produce certainty, but produces enough signal to guide attention. And that was the key. Attention, not surveillance. Because the diary did not read like passive watching. It read like directed focus, which meant the observer was not simply present. They were selecting moments, choosing when to observe. And selection requires anticipation. Cole requested a final behavioral synthesis report on Harold Vance based on all available data streams. The resulting profile was not a psychological portrait in the traditional sense. It was a pattern model. Stable external routine. Minimal deviation over extended periods. High temporal predictability. Strong spatial anchoring to a fixed residential point. And most significantly, consistent alignment with external environmental cycles documented in the diary. The final line of the report was understated, but it carried weight. Subject demonstrates sustained behavioral synchronization with observed system. Synchronization again. That word had now appeared in multiple independent analyses. And each time it appeared, it moved the interpretation slightly closer to inevitability. But still, inevitability was not admissibility. And that gap remained unbridgeable. Until a final, unexpected detail emerged from archived emergency dispatch logs. A call had been recorded in the early hours of March 14, 2002. It was never fully investigated at the time due to misclassification as a false or accidental connection. The audio was faint, partially distorted, and lasted only a few seconds before disconnection. But with modern enhancement techniques, the fragment was recovered. What remained was not a clear conversation. It was ambient sound, and beneath it, something rhythmic, mechanical, intermittent. The same pattern detected in earlier environmental reconstructions. Controlled activation cycles. But there was something else in the recording that had previously been lost in noise. A brief, almost imperceptible shift in background acoustics, like movement near a microphone source. Not distant, not environmental. Close. Too close to be accidental. Cole listened to that fragment repeatedly, without speaking. Not because it confirmed anything definitively, but because it aligned too precisely with everything else. Diary interruption timing. Electrical anomalies. Spatial sightline reconstruction. Behavioral synchronization patterns. All converging again on the same window. 2:10 to 2:15 a.m. The moment the system stopped writing. And the moment Lillian Hart stopped being observed as a continuous subject. The investigation team gathered for what would become the final internal briefing on the case. There was no dramatic announcement. No official declaration of closure. Just a recognition that all investigative pathways had reached their structural limit. Cole presented the synthesis in quiet terms. Not accusation. Not conclusion. Just alignment. Observation patterns. Spatial correlation. Temporal convergence. Behavioral consistency. And at the center of all four layers, unchanged across every reconstruction, was a single constant. Harold Vance's adjacency to Lillian Hart. When the briefing ended, there was a long silence that no one attempted to fill. Not because there was nothing left to say, but because anything further would require crossing the boundary between analysis and assertion. And that boundary still held.
Technically,
Legally.
procedurally,
But not conceptually. Cole left the room and returned alone to the case files one last time. He did not look for new evidence. He looked for structure one final time, as if repetition might reveal something missed. It did not. Everything remained exactly where it had always been.
perfectly aligned.
Perfectly unresolved. And that was when he finally wrote the last line of his private record. Not as conclusion. Not as accusation. But as recognition of what the system had become. This case was never about finding what happened to Lillian Hart. It was about realizing that nothing in Willow Creek was ever outside observation. He closed the file. And for the first time in years, the silence that followed did not feel like absence. It felt like something that had always been there, waiting,